I think that the Bible and the Dead Sea Scrolls are perplexing. It's very natural for us to have questions. If we are thinking about these things at all, questions should arise in our minds. So I don't want you to be hesitant or embarrassed to ask a question. Raise your hand. I'll take questions during the seminar, and we'll also leave some time at the very end for questions as well. You with me? Amen. Can you handle that? I know some of you outspoken people, will be on that. But even the introverts, you can ask questions too. All right. The most amazing archaeological find of the 21st century was found by a goat. 1946, in the Dead Sea region of the land of Judea, some Bedouin shepherds, goat herds, were out with their flocks when a goat strayed off from the rest of the herd. One of the young Bedouin shepherds went looking for the goat and saw that perhaps it had gone up into a cave high on one of the cliffs. Now, a desert cave that's dark, high up on a cliff, there may be some things in there that could be surprising or perhaps venomous. And so the shepherd boy did not just want to go into that cave, unsure if the goat was really in there. So he picked up a stone and threw it through the entrance of the cave. And what he expected to hear was maybe a thud or maybe a meh. But instead what he heard was the sound of breaking pottery. And so, he threw another stone and heard the same sound. Now his curiosity was aroused, and he went into the cave, and what he found in the cave were 7 tall cylindrical jars containing ancient scrolls that were about 2,000 years old. This discovery, Cave 1 of the Qumran site there in the Dead Sea, led to a whole host of other caves that in the course of the next 10 years would be explored, revealing some 930 documents made up by 15,000 scroll fragments. One of the greatest finds, in my estimation, the greatest archaeological find of the 21st century. So let's talk a little bit about the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Why are they so important? Why is this such a big deal and worth our attention? So if you notice, by the way, the little 1 in the top left-hand side, we're on page 1 in the notes if you want to follow along. So let me just share with you a very brief outline of what was found in these 11 caves in Qumran. So again, 930 documents, meaning 930 different texts or books, 930 different works of literature. But these were not primarily found intact. That first cave, Cave 1, there were 7 scrolls in clay jars that were found mostly intact. They were in pretty good shape. But in the rest of the caves, the scrolls were not, for the most part, in jars, but had been left 2,000 years ago, just sitting on the ground there in the cave. And so you can imagine what happens over time to something that's made of parchment or papyrus. Parchment is an animal skin that has been dried and scraped and stretched. Papyrus, of course, was made from the crushed reeds in ancient Egypt. Most of the Dead Sea Scrolls are parchment. But 2,000 years is a long time, right? You write a grocery list and leave it on the ground, you're not going to expect it to be there a few months or even a year later, let alone 2,000 years. And we're going to talk about how they were preserved this long period of time. But so 15,000 fragments. So most of these documents are in small little tiny pieces that scholars had to fit together to make sense of them. These documents were written in 3 languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, primarily ancient Hebrew. About 80 to 90% were written in ancient Hebrew. Another portion written in Aramaic, which is was the common trade language of the time. Jesus, when he spoke, he often spoke Aramaic. We know this from the gospel accounts. This was the common language of the land of Judea. And then there was a few scrolls written in Greek, which of course would be the language that's going to overtake Aramaic as the common language. It's going to be the language that the New Testament is written in. So these scrolls and scroll fragments date to 250 BC. So just to get a perspective, that's about 2,275 years ago. That's a long time ago from our perspective. Some of them date up to just before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, to about 68 AD. And we'll talk a little bit more about that timing here in just a moment. So now for the significance. Prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest biblical Hebrew manuscripts that we had dated to 920 and 1080 AD. These are the Aleppo and Leningrad codices. So a codice is a bound book. When we think of a book, it's what is known in the scholarly circles as a codex. The Dead Sea Scrolls were, of course, scrolls, right? A document that you roll up. So the Aleppo and Leningrad codex contained what was called the Masoretic text, by Masoretic or Hebrew scribes, and dated to about 1,000 years ago. So the Dead Sea Scrolls moved back the earliest date of Old Testament biblical manuscripts that we had by more than 1,000 years. That's a big deal. It's actually a very big deal. If you have been around people who are skeptical of the Bible, one of the things that people say is, we can't trust the Bible that we have because it's not probably anything like what was originally written. And for a long time, for the Old Testament, there was 1,000 years between, more than 1,000 years between when the books were written and the oldest manuscript that we have. Now, why was there such a big gap in time? Well, the Hebrew scribes and later Christian scribes were very meticulous in copying a work. But as you can imagine, an ancient document on papyrus or primarily parchment is not going to last forever. These documents were not just set on a museum shelf somewhere under glass, but they were being used in synagogues and churches. People's hands, the oil from their hands are, these documents are being rolled and unrolled, on a weekly, sometimes daily basis. And so they begin to wear and fade and, rip. And the Christians and Hebrews viewed the documents as sacred in the same way that we might view a flag. And so what happens when you have an American flag that gets tattered and gets holes and gets worn? Well, we replace it with a newer one, right? Out of respect for what that stands for. Well, the same thing was done for ancient manuscripts. And so they didn't see the oldest tattered manuscripts as the most valuable. They saw it as something that wasn't honoring the sacred scripture. And so they would go through the laborious effort of recopying a scroll, and then they would discard, sometimes bury or burn the ancient manuscript. Now, we wish they hadn't done that. But the Dead Sea Scrolls give us an insight 1,000 years back in time from the oldest manuscripts that we had. So it's a very big deal. Very big deal. And we'll talk a little bit more, but by and large, the manuscripts found in the Dead Sea line up amazingly closely to the later documents that are 1,000 years younger than them. So 1,000 years between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Leningrad and the Aleppo Codex, and there's no significant differences. Now, there are some places where language is updated, where meaning like we don't spell words the same as we did when Shakespeare wrote. You know, he adds a few extra U's and O's and things to some of his words. And so the spelling and usage of language in some of these documents had been updated over time, but there was no significant change in meaning, which is amazing. We cannot say this about other ancient documents such as, you know, the writings of Homer or, you know, anything. In the same way, we can confidently say we have an accurate transmission of the text with the Bible. Okay, let me pause here for just a moment. Questions or comments just about the significance, the big picture of the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves? Okay, so let's talk a little bit. We're laying a broad picture of the Dead Sea Scrolls, especially in this session. And next session, we're going to talk a little bit more about how the Dead Sea Scrolls relate to the book of Daniel and its interpretation. So we're going to start out broad, kind of lay a foundation of what the scrolls are, who wrote them, what we can know about the people who wrote them. We'll talk some about Daniel in this session. And then our next session, part 2, will focus exclusively on the Dead Sea Scrolls in the book of Daniel. So let's talk about where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, because this is very significant to their preservation. So the Dead Sea Scrolls were found near the Dead Sea. Of course, this is where they get their name. This is, if you are in Jerusalem and you head east and you follow what is called a wadi. This is a river or stream bed that only has water in it during, it's a very dry and arid region. So certain times of the year there's water in there, but the rest of the time it's just a dry creek bed. If you start heading down Wadi Qumran, about 12 miles of a downhill descent from Jerusalem will land you at Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. Now, this also happens to be the lowest spot on earth. All right? This is significantly lower than sea level. The Dead Sea, the Jordan River flows into the Dead Sea, but because it's the lowest spot on earth, there is nothing that flows out of the Dead Sea. So water comes into the Dead Sea continually, and the water simply evaporates there, leaves behind its nutrients, salt, magnesium, potassium, and this is why the Dead Sea is the Dead Sea, because it is 10 times saltier than the ocean. So nothing can live in there. There's no, maybe there's some bacteria life, but there's no plants, there's no fish, there's no, mollusks or anything like that. I've had the privilege of going to the Dead Sea, and I don't normally float very well in a swimming pool, but there in the Dead Sea, because of the salinity and the concentration of salt and minerals in the water, I can float very, very easily. So a very unique place. Historically, geographically, but also very close to Jerusalem. It's a completely different sense between being in Jerusalem and the Dead Sea, because the Dead Sea is very isolated. It's desert. Things don't grow well there. It's a very arid and desolate region, which we believe is why those who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, we'll talk about that here in a little bit, chose this place to live. They were not trying to be where other folks were. They're going to one of the most remote places they could, and the Dead Sea fit that category. So this is a view of the Dead Sea from the site of Qumran. This is where the Dead Sea Scrolls have been found. They were found, we'll talk about the settlement there at Qumran, but they were found on the cliffs just above, in caves, above the site of Qumran. So this is, we already saw a picture of Cave 1 of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is a picture of Cave 4 of the Dead Sea Scrolls. You can see that is not very easy to get to, is it? This is very inaccessible. This is actually one of the few caves. There's 11 caves that the scrolls were found in. This is one of the few caves that is actually man-made. So this cave was dug out by the community in a very difficult spot to get to. We will see that some folks lived in the caves, but they also used the caves to store scrolls. Cave 4 was the cave that contained the majority of the scrolls. Cave 4 alone had over 15,000 fragments in it. But unfortunately, the scrolls in Cave 4 were very fragmentary. So sometimes the fragments are just the size of a coin, and they might have just a letter or two of Hebrew on them, and then scholars have to go back and try to piece these fragments together like an ancient jigsaw puzzle. Now let me just pause here and just mention the remoteness, salinity, and aridness of the region is why the Dead Sea Scroll fragments survived at all. So you imagine just taking these scrolls and just putting them on the floor of a cave. How long would you expect them to last? But because the region is so incredibly dry, it rains there very, very rarely. There in the caves, the scrolls were out of the sun. They're out of the rain. Cave 4 especially, it's very remote and hard to access. So humans aren't there, finding the scrolls and damaging them or taking them. The salinity in the air of the region, the salt content in the air itself inhibited microbial growth, and so the scrolls were preserved. Pretty amazing. So the first cave, the scrolls are in jars, but the rest of the caves, the scrolls are just there on the ground. And the fact that they're preserved at all, I see as miraculous. I see that God had his hand in allowing these scrolls to be preserved for 2,000 years, and maybe he nudged the goats to say, okay, now it's time. Let's let folks know about them. So very interesting from a geographic perspective. Perhaps no place else on earth would the scrolls have survived unattended to for that period of time. This is perhaps the one place on earth that they would have lasted in the way that they did. So let's talk about the site of Qumran itself. So this is over on page 3 of your notes. So the caves are in cliffs up above the settlement. We found archaeological ruins. Scientists and scholars have found archaeological ruins down below, about a mile from the Dead Sea. And this is known as as Khirbet, which means archaeological site, Khirbet Qumran. So the archaeological site of Qumran. A couple things to notice here. What they found in this site, ritual baths. This was used for ritual purity, and you'll notice, if you follow the number ones, these are all over. I think there's 6 or 7 ritual baths alone that were used. These were not so much to cleanse your body from dirt, but to cleanse you from ritual impurity. Now, this is a very big deal to Jews in the ancient world, especially to the sect there at Qumran. You can imagine how precious water was to them. They collected water. They had these channels that would collect rainwater in these cisterns. And daily, if you were a resident there at Qumran, you would take a bath in these mikvotes to ritually cleanse you. So this was water was at a premium, and they used water on a daily basis to ritually cleanse themselves. So we have aqueducts and cisterns that catch the rainwater when it does rain a couple times a year. We have a large dining room and meeting hall. We know that these people primarily ate their meals communally. And we'll talk more about that. And this was seen as kind of a sacred time together. It wasn't just a physical meal, but it had spiritual significance. There's a kiln. They made their own pottery. They had other industries as well. What's that?
Do you know how many, or do they know how many people actually live there?
Great question. So based on the size of the site, let me repeat the question. Thank you, Mark. So the question is, how many people lived at the site of Qumran? So we know based on the size of the site, the meeting room, the farming that took place, there were some barley fields and dates that were farmed, goats that were herded, how many people that could have supported. No more than 200. The maximum would have been about 200 people living here, probably somewhere between 100 and 200 people. There's a graveyard nearby, and all of this attests to a very small community. Now, this community was there at Qumran for about 200 years, from about 150 BC or so, we estimate, till about 68 AD, up until just before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. So, over the period of years, you have, a number of people who've lived there, but at any given time, perhaps no more than 200 at most.
Now, did they know that the Qumran site before the scrolls were found, had that been estimated?
It had not been investigated before the scrolls were found. So when scholars found these scrolls, the first question they're asked is, well, where'd they come from? How'd they end up here in this remote, desolate region? And so they began excavating. There's ruins there, stone ruins, and then that's how they found the site of Qumran.
No women live there, right?
So this is a good question. Don's question is, did any women live there at Qumran? This is a question that's up to debate. We'll talk about this when we talk about who the people were at Qumran and what their beliefs were. In the graveyard that is next to the site of Qumran, there's about 1,000 graves. Just a few of those graves have been studied and investigated by archaeologists. And among the few, so perhaps a dozen or 2 dozen graves have been looked at, there were a few skeletal remains that probably belong to females. Now, there's some challenges with this. We'll talk about this a little bit more. We don't know that those graves were from the people who lived at Qumran. There were Bedouins who lived in the area and shepherded their flocks in the period between when those who wrote the scrolls fled and when the scrolls were found. And it's very probable that the Bedouins also used that graveyard and buried their dead there. The bones have dried out so much that they cannot be carbon dated, and so we cannot actually date those bones to the time that the sect of Qumran lived there. So this is a question that is, a lot of ink is spilled over that question, but we don't know. But it's possible that there were some women, although the graves that were looked at, a majority of them were male. A majority of them clearly were male. Yes, another question here.
So my brain's working delayed, but back to the first and sections. But I find it interesting that we talk about the degradation of it, the little pieces, the jigsaw and all that. But, so it was falling apart, and it sounds like at your point, it would have become useless. And so God set all this up. My question from the first part is, were there thoughts and standards that people lived by that were changed with that 1,000-year period between the things that they had in these scrolls? What were there any theological points that were filled?
Now that's a whole can of worms. So Kevin's question is, what changed in the 1,000 years between the sect who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls and the later texts that we have? This is a huge question. We're going to talk about this. We're going to spend some time on this because those who lived there at Qumran were very unique, and a lot did change. And we can understand a little bit about the ancient world through the lens of trying to understand who they were. So good question. All right. So there at the site of Qumran, we have a kitchen, we have a tower, and we also have, very importantly, a scribal room. So you can see here, this is a illustration of what scholars believe the scribal room looked like, the scriptorium. So in the top right-hand side, you see this elevated workbench, and this was found in a room where there were also found inkwells. So we believe that this is the place where the scrolls were written. Clearly, to have a writing surface and ink wells in such a remote and arid place, there's intentionality happening here, right? And so this scriptorium is where scholars believe that the majority, at least, of the Dead Sea Scrolls were composed or copied. This is a view, a picture I took actually, of the scribe's room. You can see it's long and narrow. And if you noticed in the previous picture that workbench was long and narrow, right? Because remember, you're working not with a book, you're working with a scroll. And some of these scrolls could be 20 or 30 or 40 feet in length. So as you are working, you need a long surface to be able to unroll the scroll, and this is exactly what we found in the scribe's room. Okay, so now let's begin talking a little bit, and we're going to have to move very quickly here, about who wrote the scrolls. What do we know about who wrote the scrolls? This seminar, I'm going to take what is known as the Essene hypothesis. This is the view held by a majority of scholars that the Dead Sea Scrolls were written by a Jewish sect of the Essenes that lived there on the site of Qumran. Now, there are other hypotheses that they were written by zealots or that they were written by early Christians. And to be honest, there simply is really no substantial evidence for any of the other theories. The Essene theory is the one that has a preponderance of evidence. And I'm just going to very quickly walk you through what we know about the Essenes and why we believe that they are the ones who wrote the scrolls. Okay? So perhaps the best piece of evidence we have comes from the Roman historian, scientist, general, geographer, Pliny the Elder. He's this kind of Roman polymath, and he wrote about the region of the Dead Sea. He was interested in the region from a geographic perspective. It's interesting, right? He travels all over the Roman world, and he's writing about things that he sees, history and geography and science, and he writes about the Dead Sea region because it's the lowest spot on Earth. And, water flows in, but it doesn't flow out. You've got these salts and these minerals and, the aridness of the region. It's very interesting from a geologic perspective and a geographic perspective. And notice what he says. Lying on the west of the Dead Sea and sufficiently distant to escape its noxious exhalations are the Essenes, a people that live apart from the world. Notice what he says there, apart from the world, and marvelous beyond all others throughout the world, throughout the whole earth, for they have no women among them. To sexual desire they are strangers, money they have none, the palm trees are their only companions. Day after day, however, their numbers are fully recruited by multitudes of strangers that resort to them. Below this people was formerly the town of En-Gedi. So a number of things that Pliny says about this Essene group that's living there next to the Dead Sea. He says they're on the west side. They're to the north of this place called En-Gedi. They're apart from the world. They have this religious zeal that they don't marry, but instead the way that they populate their community is by recruiting people who come to them, and they only have palm trees as companions. Quite the picture here by Pliny the Elder. Well, just reviewing our map of where the Dead Sea Scrolls are located, on the west side of the north end of the Dead Sea is the site of Qumran. South of them, on the west side of the Dead Sea, is the site of En-Gedi. This is where David flees to the wilderness. In the Old Testament, there's a little settlement there. There's some springs there. Qumran is the only site that is north of En-Gedi that can fit at all Pliny's description. So when Pliny says that these Essenes are living north of En-Gedi on the west side of the Dead Sea, there's no other place that they could have been other than the site of Qumran. So we believe that Pliny was talking about the sect there at Qumran, and he identified them as the Jewish sect of the Essenes. Okay, I saw a hand somewhere. Yes, sir.
Is there any evidence that it was also an escape route for criminals who would seek shelter there, away from the authorities?
No, there is no evidence for that. Okay, so Don's question is there any evidence that the Essene community was a escape route for criminals who are fleeing from the authorities? To my knowledge, there is no evidence of that. The Essenes, in their documents, were very careful about who they allowed into the community. And you had to go through an initiation process that took years and was very rigorous in order to be admitted into the community. And if you messed up, you were going to miss out on meals sometimes for weeks at a time or be kicked out of the community. They were very, very strict. And so just a criminal, this is not a community that you can just, join just on a whim. All right. So what I want to do right now is just look at two more descriptions by ancient sources about the Essene sect and what we know about them. This comes from Philo. Philo is a Jew who lives in the Greek city of Alexandria, that is in ancient Egypt. Philo writes a lot about kind of the intersection of Jewish thought, biblical thought, and Greek philosophy. But one of the things he did was he wrote a little bit about the Essenes. You can find this on page 8 in your notes. We're not going to look at everything that Philo says for the sake of time about the Essenes, but notice with me just a few things here. In this country lived more than 4,000 in number called Essenes. So notice he puts the total number of Essenes for all of the land of Judea about 4,000. Now, we believe at that time that there was somewhere between maybe 150 to 250,000 Jews living in the land of Judea. So 4,000 Essenes is just a very small, they're a minority. The Pharisees made up the largest sect of the Jews. The Sadducees and the Zealots would have been significantly larger than the Essenes. The Essenes are a very thin slice of Judaism at the time. All right. Let's see. They have shown themselves especially devout in the service of God, not by offering sacrifices of animals, but by resolving to sanctify their minds. The first thing about these people is that they live in villages and avoid the cities. Okay, this makes sense, what we know so far about Qumran. Because of the iniquities which have become inveterate among city dwellers, for they know that their company would have a deadly effect upon their own souls, like a disease brought by a pestilential atmosphere. So these people are fleeing from other people like they are spiritually diseased, right? And you can see why this would motivate somebody to go to one of the most remote, inhospitable regions in all of Judea. You've got to have a pretty good motivation to live in a place like the Dead Sea. Now, the Essenes, according to Philo and we'll see in Josephus, were not just in the Dead Sea region. They're scattered all throughout the land of Judea, but they're living in remote regions throughout the land. All right. So let's very quickly talk about Josephus and what he says about this Essene sect. So this is page 10 and onwards in your notes. Josephus was an ancient Jewish historian. He was a general for the Jews in the Jewish war. He was captured by the Romans and became a historian of the Jewish-Roman war by the patronage of the Romans. So the Romans employed him to write a history of the Jewish-Roman war. So when Josephus writes, he is writing primarily for a Greek and Roman audience, telling them about the history of the Jews and the Jewish war. Okay? He writes a lot about the Essenes. He talks about 4 Jewish sects: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Zealots. And even though the Essenes are the thinnest slice of Judaism, he spends more time talking about them than any other. Now, why would that be? Well, they're curious, they're peculiar, they're strange, and so we as a humans sometimes have a tendency to focus on the oddballs, the odd man out, and Josephus does this. Now, he lets us know that he actually had spent time as a teenager when he was trying to find his way in life, living with all the different Jewish groups. He spent time with the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes, and the Zealots, and so he knows personally about them firsthand. And this is what he says. He says that I'm summarizing here, he says that they're known for being strict and pious. More strict even than the other Jews of ancient Judaism at that time. For instance, he tells us that on the Sabbath day, this is shocking to our modern sensibilities, that the Essenes would not go to the bathroom in order to refrain from defiling the Sabbath. Now just think about that. Why would this be? Well, the Jews had certain traditions and regulations that you could not travel more than a certain distance on the Sabbath. A certain number of steps or paces, and anything other than that would be considered work and would be a violation or breaking the Sabbath. This isn't from the Bible, but this is from the tradition of the Jews that Pharisees and the Essenes had. The Essenes considered their community where they lived to be a holy place. They ate their meals as a sort of a spiritual, what we might say is like a communion sort of sense to their meals. They believed that they as a community were a living temple. And because of this holiness, remember they're very focused on ritual purity, they did not want to use the bathroom at the site of their community. So they set the distance from their bathroom. Their bathroom had to be a certain distance away from the community in order to keep the community pure, but that distance was greater than a Sabbath day's journey. So good luck. One of the other ways that we know that the Essenes were very strict and pious when it comes to ritual purity was in the pouring of liquids from one vessel to another. So there's a lot of Jewish purity laws. Again, these are not from the Bible, but these are from tradition. And the Essenes believed that impurity could flow upstream from one vessel to another. So if you have a large jar of wine or olive oil that you're pouring into a smaller vessel, and you were to find out that that smaller vessel somehow is impure, ritually unclean, they believe that that impurity would travel upstream through the flow of liquid and defile the larger vessel containing the olive oil or the wine. Now, this could be a very difficult financial hardship if you've got some expensive olive oil that you pour out into a vessel, you find out that it is impure, and now all of a sudden the larger vessel is ruined. So one of the things that we found at the Essenes were stone jars that are not found anywhere else in all of Judea. They're these tall, narrow jars with a wide mouth on the top that would have been very difficult to pour out of. Now, why would the Essenes make jars? In the other places in Judea, we find jars that have a narrow top that make it very easy to pour out of. Why would they make jars that are intentionally difficult to pour out of? Because they didn't want people pouring from one vessel to another, because you could ruin the larger vessel, because the impurity would travel. And so what they would use is they had a large jar where a skewer could be dipped in, and the liquid could be transferred to another vessel. These jars also happen to be perfect for storing scrolls, because a rolled up scroll will fit through the wide mouth perfectly in this large cylindrical jar. Okay, so just two examples, Sabbath and the pouring of liquids from vessel to vessel of the strictness of the Essene sect. Okay? Josephus said that the Essenes do not marry, that they share their possessions communally. Upon joining the sect, you forfeit all of your property. We see something similar in the New Testament, actually. You forfeit all of your property. You do not hold property privately, but what is yours is the community's, and what is the community's is yours. He also said that they practice daily prayer, ritual bathing, communal meals, that they preserve the books that belong to their sect, that they join the community through oaths, and they believe in the immortality of the soul, they believe in fate, and they study the ancients, especially the prophets, and are known for making accurate predictions. I failed to mention earlier that the scrolls that were discovered in Qumran, in the caves, were not all biblical manuscripts. About 40% of about 30% of the scrolls in Qumran were biblical manuscripts, Isaiah, Genesis, the Psalms. About another 25% were other Jewish writing known at that time that we know from Second Temple period, ancient world. So this is like the book of Enoch, the book of Jubilees, some of these sorts of things. And about another quarter of the writing that was there are sectarian works unknown to us before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are written by the sect, the Essenes there at the Dead Sea, about their views, about their community, and their way of life. And this is how we can corroborate what Josephus says here in his description of the Essenes. All of these things are true of these scrolls and how they describe the function of their community there at Qumran. All right. I think that's enough for Josephus right now. Very quickly, on page 18 of your notes is just a chart comparing the sects of Judaism at the time. Just a couple things to notice here. So, Sadducees only believed in the first 5 books of the Bible. They didn't see anything else as inspired. Because of that, that affects their beliefs. They believe in free will. They don't believe in angels. They don't believe in immortality of the soul. They don't believe in resurrection. And they don't have an apocalyptic or end-time focus. So in some sense, they are more liberal than the Pharisees or the Essenes. The Pharisees, they believe both in the Old Testament, that is Genesis through Malachi, not just the Torah, but the Psalms, the prophets, the writings, but they also believe in an oral tradition. They believe that this oral tradition was passed down orally from the elders at Mount Sinai all the way down, and this helps them to understand how to follow the rules and regulations and rituals of the Old Testament. This is one of the issues that Jesus often had conflict about with the Pharisees, was their oral tradition. He said, you make void the commandments of God by the traditions of men. This was the traditions that the Pharisees were holding to. The Essenes did not believe in the oral tradition of the Pharisees, and in fact, often they criticized the oral traditions of the Pharisees, but they had their own set of community rules and ways of interpreting the Old Testament. They also believed in Genesis through Malachi. So, for instance, the keeping of the Sabbath or the pouring of liquids in jars, this is based on the rules from their community, and as they're trying to understand how to apply the scriptures from the Old Testament. The Essenes believe in fate, meaning what you do in your life has been predetermined and ordained by God, whether good or bad, that there is no actual human choice. Now, the Sadducees believed only in free will, that nothing was determined by God. The Pharisees believed that some things are determined by God, but a lot of things are also left up to us. They hold kind of a middle ground, which is what many Christians today would hold, but the Essenes are very strict determinists. The last 2 things I just want to mention very quickly. The Essenes also had a different calendar, a solar calendar compared to a lunar solar calendar, and they were very strict in terms of rituals. And it's these last 2 things that made them very distinct from the Pharisees and Sadducees. If you cannot agree on which day, for instance, to keep the Passover, how can you be in communion with all the rest of the Jews? Or if you can't even agree on how to pour liquid out of a jar, how can you be living and in community with these others? And so even though theologically they had some differences, it was the calendar and ritual differences that were the primary distinguishing factors between the Essenes and the others. And it was these differences that caused the Essenes to label the Pharisees and the Sadducees as the sons of darkness, or the sons of the devil. They saw the other sects as in complete apostasy to God because they did not keep a correct calendar, or they did not practice the rituals in the way they believed were ordained by God. So they separated themselves from, when they say the iniquity, this disease of the others, they're not talking Romans, they're talking the other Jews. Okay, so there's some lessons there we can learn, but we don't have time to talk about it. All right. Very quickly, I've got just a few moments here. I want to talk with you about the biblical manuscripts of Daniel that are found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, the book of Daniel was one of the favorite books of the scribes at Essene. Their most favorite books were Isaiah, the Psalms, and Deuteronomy, which, by the way, are actually the most quoted books of the New Testament by the New Testament authors of the Old Testament. But Daniel also was up there. There were 11 manuscripts of the book of Daniel found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Every book of the Bible except the book of Esther, every book of the Old Testament was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. You can imagine why Esther might not have been included. If you do not marry, you don't include women in your community, why maybe would you have a book where a woman is the heroine? So every other book except Esther is found among the scrolls. The book of Daniel had 11 copies. Yes? The book of Ruth was included. There is a small portion. That is probably because the book of Ruth is really, the culmination of Ruth is the ancestry of David. And that Davidic line, King David, who's going to become a messianic figure, I think is why the book of Ruth is included, but not the book of Esther. And the book of Esther is a little bit risque, right? Esther goes in.
Didn't mention God in it.
Also, the book of Esther does not explicitly mention God. So there's some reasons why they may have excluded the book of Esther. So every chapter of the book of Daniel is included in the fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have explicit biblical copies, a portion of the biblical text from chapters 1 through 11. Chapter 12, we have a midrash, which is a kind of a commentary, a Bible commentary, explaining a Bible text, and it quotes this Floridium or midrash, quotes from Daniel 12, verse 10, so a portion of it. So we know that the entire book of Daniel was known and copied and valued by the scribes of the Dead Sea. It's a big deal. Actually, for other books of the Old Testament, we don't have every chapter of, the Psalms or Deuteronomy or Ruth, but we have every chapter of Daniel represented among the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's pretty cool. And we also know that the scribes of Qumran saw the book of Daniel as Scripture. It wasn't just a book. It wasn't just a Jewish book worth copying, but they saw it as Scripture. They used the same formula to quote from Daniel. According to the words of the prophet Daniel, it is written, as they use for Isaiah or Jeremiah. So they counted Daniel among the prophets, and they counted the book of Daniel among the canon of Scripture. Now, let me just end very quickly here as we close session 1. This is a big deal because the earliest manuscript of Daniel from the Dead Sea Scrolls dates to about 125 or perhaps even as old as 150 BC. So, you're thinking 2,150 years ago. Many critical scholars, in fact, most critical scholars, date the book of Daniel not to the Babylonian or Persian period, but they believe that the book of Daniel was written in 164 BC. Now, why do they believe that? That's a very specific date. In fact, no other book of the Bible is given a very specific year for its writing of the Old Testament like the book of Daniel. So why would they date Daniel to 164 BC? Because they believe that Daniel is not prophecy written in advance, but history written afterwards. And they believe that Daniel describes accurately the history of Antiochus Epiphanes up to 164 BC. In 167, he desecrates this temple, sacrifices a pig there in the temple to Zeus. He persecutes the Jews. There's a war. Antiochus is overcome by the Jews. The temple is rededicated in 164. And the scholars say up until 164, the book of Daniel gets it all right. But then it describes, according to these scholars, Antiochus being killed in battle and being overthrown. Well, that's not how Antiochus dies. It seems like he dies perhaps from an illness when he's away on a campaign. And the last details of Daniel do not line up with what happens after 164 BC. In fact, in Daniel 11, when it's describing what, according to these scholars, they believe is the death of Antiochus, this king of the north, comes to an end without help. In Daniel 12, verse 1, it says the very next thing is Michael's going to stand up. The end time is going to happen. There's going to be a resurrection. And they say, well, they got it all wrong, right? They thought Antiochus was going to be overthrown. God's kingdom was going to be set up. People are going to be resurrected. The wicked are going to be judged. Obviously, that didn't happen in 164 or 163 BC. So the book of Daniel was written up to that point, but after that, they got it wrong. Now, that means that the book of Daniel, according to their view, is not an honest book, right? Not written by Daniel during the time of Babylon, prophecy predicted in advance. The challenge to this view that the Dead Sea Scrolls offers is, that would mean that in 164 BC, the book of Daniel is written, and then just a few years, perhaps as little as 15 years after that, the book of Daniel is considered to be scripture by the scribes of Essenes. It's being copied, it's being venerated, and it is being interpreted. Now, 15 years between the actual composition of the book and for it to be considered biblical, prophetic, true, and accurate when the prophecies they believe failed, right? So these aren't people who understand, who don't understand that, Antiochus, wasn't, killed in this way. These are people who were there. So that whole theory just really falls apart by the old date that we have of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which means that we can have confidence that the book of Daniel was written before this, that it's not history written afterwards, but it's prophecy written beforehand. And this tells us not only something about Daniel and the prophecies, but about God who inspired the Bible. That we can have confidence in this book and the God who inspired this book. And this is a very big deal. This is a very big deal, and many people and scholars fail to realize the significance of these ancient manuscripts of the book of Daniel. Okay, I'm out of time for session 1. We've covered a lot of ground. Let me take just a minute or two for questions. We'll take a very brief break and come back for session number 2. We've got a question over here. So this is a great question, and I forgot to mention this. So the question is, didn't the Essenes die out because they didn't marry? The Essene sect disappeared, but from what we know, it's not because they didn't marry. So think about what we know about the scrolls. These 7 scrolls that are in jars in Cave 1, but you have hundreds of other scrolls that are just left on the ground in caves. That seems to be done in almost a hurried sort of manner, right? I mean, if you take months and months to copy a scroll, why are you just going to leave it on top of the ground in a cave? So there is somehow the scriptorium in Qumran was emptied, and these scrolls were transferred in a hurried fashion to the cave as the community was fleeing. Well, we know from the dates of coins found there at Qumran that around 68 AD, this is just before the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. We don't have any coins dating till after 68 AD. Coins are a very helpful way to date the community there. So no coins after 68 AD. The community apparently flees. They leave behind the scrolls there in the caves. So the Romans are coming in. The Romans are mad. The Jews are mad at them. People are dying and getting killed. And so they, even though they're in a remote area, they're not that far from Jerusalem. And in fact, there's a Jewish fortress, Masada, that is a stronghold for the Jews. That's going to become the last place that the Jews take their stand against the Romans. And so the Romans are in the area. They are scouting out for bands of Jewish guerrillas that might attack them. So the Essenes, especially because some of their writings describe a war where the Romans would be destroyed. We'll talk about that in our next session. They do not want the Romans to find these scrolls because they will all be crucified, literally, if these scrolls are found by the Romans. So they are hid very quickly in the caves, and the Essenes flee. We believe that many of the Essenes may have fled from the Qumran sect. Again, there's Essenes all over Judea, but the Essenes in the Qumran sect may have fled to the temple fortress, to the plateau fortress of Masada, where just a few years after the destruction of Jerusalem, the Romans are going to lay siege and destroy all the Jews that are there. Some of them, we believe, went there because of some scrolls that were found there, but the rest of them fled, maybe were vanished, killed in Jerusalem if they went to Jerusalem, and, as part of the siege. But they died out because of the Roman war, is our understanding. Good question. Any other questions? Okay, so we're going to end this session. We'll take a break. If you would like to go get some water, there's restrooms in the hallways. Women's restroom is in this hallway. Men's restroom is around. We'll come back here. We're going to aim to start at 11:06, session number 2. And we will, we've got a lot of ground to cover, so full throttle. If you can make it back here, that would be great.